Alright, welcome. For this particular lesson, we will be looking at how Singapore can avoid water shortage, which is part 5 in our unit on water. The corresponding information can also be found from page 156 to 160 of your textbook. Generally, we'll be looking at the 3 approaches and 7 actions that Singapore has taken to avoid water shortage. So your 3 approaches are reducing water consumption, increasing water supply, and conserving water through protection of water resources. So we begin with approach number 1. Okay, reducing water consumption. 2 main ways in which how Singapore reduces water consumption. One is through the billing system, the other one is through education of the public. So in terms of water pricing, we do adopt a very staged water pricing system. So as you can see here from the figure 4.53, which is also found in your textbook, we do charge a differing rate depending on the amount of water that you've consumed. So the more water you consume, the higher price you will be made to pay. This hopefully encourages people not to waste water and to use every single drop of water responsibly. Okay? But we have to bear in mind that water is an essential item and everybody in society will need access to water, whether you're rich or poor. And when you do have this kind of water billing system that is dependent on volume, you may run into a case where the poor are in a situation where they cannot afford the full amount of water that they may need for daily survival. So Singapore also has an approach that deals with this through the provision of help like the GST vouchers. The poor are given cash incentives to offset certain price changes or certain price increase in essential items. So essentially, nobody is left behind. Now to look at the pros and cons of using these methods. Pros, of course, is it creates an awareness of the value of water in the local population itself. Because when it comes to a point where it hurts your pocket, you then truly appreciate the value of water. The cons, of course, are increased cost of production for industries. So if you do have a factory that's in Singapore and you do need water, like what we mentioned in the earlier part, the cost may increase. The second action that is taken is, of course, educating the public. Through the WELS scheme, the water efficiency labeling scheme, many of our electrical appliances come with the corresponding label telling you how efficient the water efficiency is of that particular device, and hence encouraging residents and citizens of Singapore to purchase equipment that will be water efficient, hence saving them money in the long run. Another one of the education outreach programs is the PUB's water saving kits, where they actually send thimbles to new households, and if you want one, you can actually make an application through an email to them to ask for a set of these thimbles to insert into your tap. So these thimbles actually restrict the amount of water that comes out from the tap, and as a result of that reduces the water that is used when you keep your tap running. Pros and cons of educating the public. It increases awareness, of course, and it allows you to take active action to reduce the amount of water that you are using. Now, cons wise, of course, it takes time. Things like this takes time for people to accept, for people to adopt, and for people to come on the bandwagon. And it also is highly dependent on individual desire for action. So what you may end up with is the poor people will uptake this, but then those who can afford it may not be bothered. Now the other approach that Singapore looks at is increasing water supply. So you try to reduce the amount of water that Singaporeans and the local residents use, and at the same time you try to increase the water supply available to our local population. So we very famously have our 4 taps, which we've talked about this repeatedly in class, right? Through local water catchment, imported water, NEWater, and desalination. These are our 4 main taps that we have used to increase our water supply. Now if you were to look at the catchment of Singapore, right, actually on whole we do have a lot of water catchment all around the island itself. We have many reservoirs as well as a lot of fast flowing drainage systems. So whenever there's any sort of rain that falls on the island, there's a very high chance that it's actually captured and diverted into one of our many numerous reservoirs. in total we have 17 reservoirs currently. 2/3 of our land is also comprised of catchment areas, and with the government's plan by 2060, which you should still be alive, and it should increase to about 90%. So when you have larger catchment area, you will have the ability to catch more of the rainwater, and that would reduce our reliance on the other 3 taps. So what are the pros and cons of catchment then? If pros, of course, rainwater is free. Okay, all you need to pay for is purification costs and then storage costs. The cons of it is if you are going to use an area of catchment, generally it is not developed. Okay, or it has to be co-developed to have sufficient flora and fauna. Otherwise, you will not be able to be an effective catchment area. Then the next thing is, of course, storage. Storage is a very big issue in Singapore because it means that you are losing space that could have been used for other purposes. So storage is a very big problem in terms of opportunity cost. Our third tab is, of course, importing water from Johor, which we have been doing for over 100 years, coming to 100 years. Right, we started in 1927. We started buying water from Johor, but this is not a long-term solution, and you should have read enough information about over the years what the Malaysian government has repeatedly tried to do to renegotiate the price of the water that we buy from them. So pros, of course, it is very cheap. Right, buying water from Malaysia is very cheap for us. A short quantity, we are guaranteed a certain quantity until the contract ends, which is 2061. So the problem with that is after 2061 there is no assurance. Okay, it is not a long-term solution. There is an end point to it, and some point in the future we will not be looking forward to having water from Malaysia anymore. Now the third tab, okay, one of my favorite tabs is of course NEWater, right? NEWater, commonly known as the treated used water. So what we do is we recycle our water. It is important, you need to remember the few key terms here. The process is reverse osmosis, right? How do we do it? We do it through microfiltration. Okay, and at the end of it, the clean water is once again given an extra layer of disinfection. I believe I mentioned this before. The UV, ultraviolet ray disinfection, is an unnecessary step that we take to generate peace of mind and to be assured that the NEWater is actually really totally safe to drink. So NEWater is one of our third tab that we have talked about. What are the pros of NEWater? Well, it's reused water, so your source is basically never ending. Okay, you have a large ready supply, not only from residential but also from industrial wastewater. Okay, the cons, like if you think back to every single time you've seen me talk about this in the classroom, when I show you my water bottle and tell you 20% of it is actually recycled water, which basically comes from you in your discharges. Okay, so it's a psychological thing. There's no taste and no toxicity about the NEWater. It is perfectly safe to drink. However, many of you still think it's very gross. Okay, so it is a psychological concern. And in terms of the second con, it is actually very expensive to produce. So compared to buying water from Malaysia, right, water is so much more expensive, but it gives us longevity. It gives us the assurance that we are not held hostage by anyone else. The final tab is something that's very similar to NEWater. It's called desalination. So desalination, the only difference between our way of doing desalination and our way of recycling NEWater is the source. Instead of using sewage or wastewater, we are actually now using salt water as our source for desalination. So you still use the reverse osmosis process, where ultra microfiltration, where we actually push the water through microfilters, and what you end up with is clean. Now, what are your pros of using desalination? Desalination, your source is seawater. We're an island, so technically we have almost a limitless supply of seawater. Like our NEWater, okay, the source is not a big issue at all, but this is really expensive. This costs even more than NEWater to produce. So it's the intricacies of trying to clean seawater, which is actually technically, when you look at it, is harder to clean than sewage. So the final approach that Singapore takes is, of course, besides educating people about water usage, trying to get you to use less water, trying to find you more water to use, the third one is to conserve what water resources we have currently. One of the biggest conservation efforts that we have put out is the ABC Waters system. right? Working together with PUB and MParks, where they convert our waterways into recreation zones so that people have a greater awareness of the waterways, and it hopefully reduce the pollution that it experiences. Now, Friends of the Water program is another one where they actually partner schools and companies to adopt some of these waterways that may be near your office, near your school itself. So adoption doesn't mean just go and take photos and and do some rah-rah activities. Actually, it involves protection, regular maintenance, and regular cleaning done by the schools or the partner companies itself. So what you see here is the third one, ABC Water Learning Trails, where PUB actually conducts water learning experiences for students to give them a greater awareness of how the water bodies are used, not only by the humans but by the nature, birds, as well as nowadays the big thing is the otters. So how nature has started to reclaim all this, and through the learning trails they have more exposure to how we use our 4 taps in total to maintain water supply. So in conclusion, right, it's very important, you have to remember this. Singapore does a lot to protect our water supplies and to ensure that we have water for use for the future generations. Because of this, water is essential for living. If we don't have water, we will die. So there's a very urgent need to protect not only the local water supply but the global water supply, and to ensure that it doesn't run out. All of you have a role to play in this, and only through the sharing of what we've learned with families and friends, through the active use of water saving habits and the conscious efforts in keeping our waterways clean, can we continue to allow Singapore to have an endless supply of potable water for all its residents. So once again, this is a very brief summary. The content itself is from page 156 to 160. Please remember, we are looking at Singapore as a case study, and it is very important that you remember all the relevant Singapore case studies. Okay? Good luck for your exams.